I stood on the cold marble of my living room while my husband of 20 years raised a glass with my mother and my best friend. They had just declared me mentally unstable to steal the tech empire I built from scratch. They smiled as they kicked me out, forgetting one crucial detail. When you are the architect of the castle, you know exactly which brick keeps the walls from collapsing, and I was about to pull it out. My name is Elena Vance, and at 42 years old, I believed the hardest part of my week was over. I had just spent 18 hours on a plane after a grueling week in Tokyo, salvaging a contract that would keep Nexus Systems solvent for the next 5 years. The Seattle rain was coming down in sheets, a relentless gray curtain that matched the exhaustion in my bones. All I wanted was the silence of my master bedroom and the warmth of the fireplace. I keyed in the code to the front gate, the iron swinging open with a familiar groan, and drove up the winding driveway of the estate I had bought with my first major bonus. I expected darkness. Instead, the villa was blazing with light. Every chandelier in the foyer and the living room was on full power. I dropped my suitcase by the door, the wet wheels leaving tracks on the hardwood. Walking into the living room, the air felt heavy, completely devoid of oxygen. My mother, Martha, was sitting in the high-backed velvet armchair at the head of the room. My husband, Derek, stood by the mantel, nursing a glass of amber liquid. And there, sitting on the sofa with her legs crossed, was Sasha, my best friend of 30 years. They were waiting for me. I started to ask what was happening, but my mother cut me off. She did not stand up to hug me. She did not ask about the flight. She told me to sit down because they needed to discuss my behavior. She used the word intervention. The room spun slightly. Derek stepped forward, his face arranged into a mask of pained concern that I had seen him practice in the mirror before board meetings. He told me that I was unwell. He said the stress of the company had finally snapped my mind and that I had become erratic and dangerous. He looked at Sasha with a softness he had not shown me in a decade. He said Sasha had been the one holding the family together while I was off chasing glory. He said she understood him. He said she listened. I looked at my mother for defense, but she only tightened her lips. She told me I was cold. She said I was a machine who cared more about servers and code than flesh and blood. She gestured to Sasha and called her a source of warmth, the kind of woman Derek actually deserved. The betrayal was physical, a sharp pain in my chest, but the true blow was yet to come. Leo walked into the room. My son, the boy I had carried, the boy I had read to every night until he was 12. He was 19 now, tall and broad, wearing a sweater Derek had bought him. He did not look at me with love. He looked at me with annoyance. He stood next to his father and Sasha, forming a united front. He told me to just stop fighting. He said I needed to accept the reality so they could finally have some peace. He called them a family, and his eyes slid right past me. That was when I saw it. The light caught the green stone resting against Sasha's throat. It was my grandmother's emerald necklace, an heirloom I kept in a safe in the master closet. She was wearing it casually, as if it belonged to her. It was not just a theft. It was a declaration that she had already taken my place long before tonight. Derek placed a document on the coffee table. It was a temporary transfer of power for Nexus Systems, granting him full executive control. He gave me a choice. I could sign it and check into a wellness facility of their choosing, or he would have the two men standing in the shadows of the hallway escort me to a psychiatric ward under an involuntary hold. He claimed to have the paperwork from a doctor already signed. I looked at them. My mother, my husband, my best friend, my son. I told them no. I told them to get out of my house. Derek nodded to the shadows. 2 private security guards, men I paid through the company accounts, stepped forward. They did not hesitate. They grabbed my arms with bruising force. I struggled, but I was exhausted and outnumbered. As they dragged me toward the front door, my heels skidding on the floor I had paid for, I looked back one last time. Sasha was not looking at Derek. She was looking at me, and she was smiling. It was a smile of pure, unadulterated victory. The heavy oak door slammed shut, and I was thrown out into the pouring rain, locked out of the life I had built. I drove blindly through the storm, the windshield wipers fighting a losing battle against the deluge. My hands were shaking so violently that the steering wheel felt like a live wire in my grip. I could not go to a hotel in the city because Derek would look for me there. And I could not go to a friend because I did not know who I could trust anymore. I just drove until the fuel light screamed at me, forcing me to pull into a desolate gas station on the edge of the highway. I stood under the flickering fluorescent lights of the pump, shivering in my soaked blazer, and swiped my black card. The screen flashed red, declined. I frowned and swiped it again. Declined. Panic began to rise in my throat like bile. I pulled out my debit card, the one linked to our joint account, and tried that. Declined. Message suspected fraud. I ran inside to the cashier, a teenager with headphones around his neck, and handed him the card. He ran it and shook his head. He told me the issuer had reported the card stolen and locked the account. My own money was being held hostage. I had to dig through my purse for the emergency cash I kept tucked in a hidden pocket, handing over a crumpled $50 bill just to put enough fuel in the tank to keep moving. Back in the car, I grabbed my phone. The screen was a graveyard of notifications. I tapped on the app for the smart home security system, desperate to see what was happening inside my house. User access revoked. I tried my banking app. Biometric login failed. Then I tried my work email. A prompt appeared asking for a password I had known by heart for 15 years, but when I typed it in, the system told me it was incorrect. I had been digitally erased. One email had slipped through to my personal account before the firewall went up completely. It was an automated notification from the Human Resources Department at Nexus Systems, the department I had built. The subject line was Notice of Immediate Suspension. The body of the email was a nightmare of legal jargon stating I was relieved of my duties as CEO pending an internal investigation into large-scale embezzlement and reports of severe psychological instability. They had not just stolen my house, they had nuked my professional reputation in a matter of hours. I ended up at a roadside motel 20 miles outside the city limits. The room cost me $60 cash. It smelled of stale cigarette smoke and bleach. The carpet was sticky, and the lock on the door looked like it could be kicked in by a child. I sat on the edge of the sagging mattress, still in my damp clothes, and stared at the peeling wallpaper. The shock began to recede, replaced by a cold, sharp clarity. This was not a spontaneous decision. You do not lock a CEO out of her company mainframe in an hour. You do not turn a 19-year-old boy against his mother in a single evening. This was a campaign. I realized Derek and Sasha must have been planning this for at least 6 months. They had been moving assets, changing administrative permissions, and poisoning Leo's mind while I was on planes flying to Tokyo and London to pay for their lifestyle. I checked my messages. The group chat with my college friends was silent, but when I looked at social media, I saw why. Derek had posted a long, heartfelt status update asking for privacy, while his wife battled a severe mental health crisis. My friends, the people I had hosted for dinner parties and charity galas, were commenting with prayer hands and support for him. They believed him. I was the workaholic, the absentee wife, the woman always on the edge. He had weaponized my dedication against me. Then a text message came through from my mother. I hoped for a second that she had come to her senses, that she had realized the madness of siding with her daughter's husband. I opened the message. It read, "I did this for your own good. Let Sasha handle the burden now. You do not deserve that happiness as much as she does." I stared at the screen until the backlight dimmed. My own mother believed I was unworthy of the life I had built. She preferred the fantasy of a perfect family with Sasha over the reality of her own daughter. I waited for the sob to rip through my chest, but it never came. The grief that had been drowning me suddenly evaporated, leaving something hard and jagged in its place. I sat up straight in the darkness of that cheap motel room. They thought they had broken me. They thought stripping me of my money and my title would leave me helpless. But they forgot that before I was a CEO, before I was a wife, I was a survivor. I wiped my face. I had nothing left to lose, and that made me the most dangerous person in their world. Lying on that lumpy mattress, staring at a water stain on the ceiling that looked like a bruised lung, my mind drifted back to the beginning. It did not start with the intervention tonight. It started on a playground 35 years ago. I was the bookworm, the girl with the thick glasses and the frizzy hair who knew the answer to every math problem but could not jump rope to save her life. Sasha was the opposite. She was the neighbor's kid, golden-haired and glowing, the kind of girl who laughed and made the whole world want to laugh with her. She was magic, and I was just the instruction manual. My mother, Martha, never let me forget the difference. She would look at Sasha with a hunger that terrified me, and then she would look at me with a sigh of resignation. She used to tell me that she wished I had just 10% of Sasha's charm. She would say it casually over dinner, slicing through my self-esteem as easily as she sliced through a pot roast. I grew up believing that love was not something I was entitled to by birth, but a commodity I had to purchase. I thought if I became successful enough, if I became indispensable, I could finally buy my mother's approval. That was the trap. I spent my entire adult life building a fortress of money and security around the people who resented me for it. I paid off Sasha's credit card debts 3 times. I bought the villa so my mother could host her bridge club in a room with an ocean view. I thought I was being a good daughter and a loyal friend, but I was just training them to see me as an ATM with a pulse. Then there was Derek. When I met him, he was a struggling model with a dazzling smile and absolutely no business acumen. I was the one who saw his potential, not as a businessman, but as a figurehead. I was the brilliant coder who lacked the social grace to pitch to investors, and he was the face. I wrote every line of code for Nexus Systems. I drafted every strategy, but I put him in the Italian suits and let him take the credit. I built him up from a man who could barely balance a checkbook into a tech mogul, believing that our partnership was the ultimate romance. I was the engine, and he was the hood ornament. It was my mother who insisted I hire Sasha. She told me Sasha was struggling and needed a purpose. She suggested the title of image consultant. I hesitated, knowing Sasha had no experience, but I could never say no to Martha. So I brought the fox into the hen house and paid her a 6-figure salary to pick out Derek's ties and organize company parties. I should have seen the signs, the lingering glances across the boardroom table, the business trips to Cabo and New York where their schedules always seemed to align perfectly while I stayed back to handle server crashes, the way Derek stopped touching me years ago, claiming stress, while he seemed to bloom with energy whenever Sasha was in the room. I was blind because I was too busy working to pay for the lifestyle they were enjoying. The cruelest realization, the one that made my stomach turn in that cheap motel room, was my mother's role in it. She did not just tolerate the affair, she orchestrated it. Martha always preferred the visual of Derek and Sasha. They were the beautiful couple she felt she deserved to be associated with. I was too sharp, too serious, too real. She encouraged them. She likely whispered in Derek's ear that he deserved a woman who was fun, a woman like Sasha. I finally understood the dynamic of my life. I was never a wife, a daughter, or a friend to them. I was a natural resource, like a coal mine or an oil field. They mined me for everything I had: my talent, my money, my energy. And now that the resource had become difficult to manage, now that I had started to ask for respect, they decided the mine was tapped out. They did not just want the money. They wanted to erase the person who earned it so they could enjoy the spoils without the guilt. I closed my eyes, the tears drying on my cheeks. They thought they had discarded trash, but they had just freed me from the burden of carrying them. I sat cross-legged on the stained carpet of the motel room, the hum of the mini-fridge the only sound in the dark. In my lap sat a heavy, battered laptop I had kept in my emergency go-bag for years. It was obsolete by modern standards, a brick compared to the sleek tablets we used at the office, but it possessed the one thing that mattered. It had a direct, hard-wired line to the kernel of the Nexus Systems mainframe. Derek and his hired IT team thought they had locked me out by revoking my admin privileges and changing the passwords. They were arrogant. They forgot that while Derek was the face on the magazine covers, I was the architect. I wrote the source code. I did not just have the keys to the castle. I knew where the secret passages were built into the walls. I bypassed the firewall completely, slipping through a digital backdoor I had coded a decade ago for emergency maintenance. It was a ghost port, invisible to standard security sweeps. The screen flickered, and then the entire nervous system of my company laid itself bare before me. I did not look for emails or texts first. I followed the money. The data that streamed across the screen was a roadmap of systematic theft. On the surface, the balance sheets looked clean, but the subledgers told a story of rot. I found a complex network of shell companies registered in tax havens, all listed innocuously as marketing partners or consulting firms. They were billing Nexus for services that never existed. Invoices for brand strategy and market analysis were being paid out monthly, draining hundreds of thousands of dollars directly into accounts controlled by a single entity. I traced that entity to a folder hidden deep in the finance drive labeled Project Phoenix. It was not a company initiative. It was a personal slush fund owned by Sasha. I watched in horror as the transaction history scrolled past. She had siphoned nearly $4 million from the company in the last 18 months. There were wire transfers for a penthouse condo in Miami, lease payments for 2 luxury SUVs, and bills for 5-star resorts in the Maldives. They were not just living off my hard work. They were cannibalizing the company to fund a lifestyle they could not afford. But the financial bleeding was only the beginning. I opened a folder of scanned contracts and felt the blood drain from my face. There were 3 high-risk business loans totaling $12 million from predatory lenders. At the bottom of each document was my signature. It was a flawless forgery. Derek had leveraged the entire future of Nexus against these loans, and by forging my name, he had ensured that if the company collapsed, the debt would fall on me personally. I would be destitute, liable for millions of dollars I never touched. I kept digging, fueled by a cold, surgical rage. I found a chain of emails between Derek and a Dr. Eris, a psychiatrist I had never met. The subject line was patient evaluation. The content was a transaction. Derek had agreed to pay the doctor $50,000 in cash. In exchange, Dr. Eris was preparing a retroactive diagnosis stating I suffered from paranoid schizophrenia and recommending immediate, long-term involuntary commitment. They were not just going to divorce me. They were planning to lock me in a padded room and drug me into oblivion so they could seize control of my assets without a fight. Finally, I found their exit strategy. A draft contract was sitting in the outbox, ready to be sent to a competitor in Shenzhen. Derek was arranging to sell the proprietary source code, the core engine I had spent 15 years perfecting, for $20 million. It was a fire sale price. He intended to sell the tech, take the cash, and flee the country, leaving the shell of the company to implode in my hands. I did not scream. I did not cry. I plugged in an encrypted external hard drive and initiated a full mirror download. Every invoice, every forged signature, every incriminatory email, and every bank transfer was copied. I built an impenetrable digital dossier, a weapon of mass destruction in legal form. Then, I did one last thing. I accessed the core code and planted a logic bomb. It was a piece of silent malware designed to trigger if the source code was transferred to an unauthorized server. It would not just stop the transfer, it would scramble the encryption keys, turning the stolen data into useless gibberish. Just as the progress bar hit 100%, a secure chat window popped up on my screen. It was Marcus, my former chief financial officer, a man of unshakable integrity whom Derek had fired 2 years ago. He had heard the rumors. He sent a single encrypted file containing proof of tax evasion Derek had committed in the previous fiscal year. I stared at the screen, the blue light reflecting in my eyes. I had the gun, I had the bullets, and now I had the fingerprints. Julian Thorne was the shark that lived in the deep waters Derek was too afraid to swim in. 5 years ago, Derek had used corporate espionage to steal a government contract from Julian, a move that made Nexus Systems famous and cost Julian millions. I knew Julian had a long memory, so I bet my entire future on his grudge. I called his private line, a number I had memorized from an old Rolodex, and told his assistant I had the head of Derek Vance on a silver platter. I met him at the Obsidian Club, a members-only fortress of mahogany and leather in the downtown district. I looked like a ghost haunting a palace. My clothes were wrinkled from sleeping in the car. My hair was pulled back in a severe knot, and I wore no makeup to hide the dark circles under my eyes. The hostess looked ready to escort me out, but Julian waved me over from a corner booth. He did not stand up. He sipped his scotch and looked me over with amusement, likely enjoying the sight of his rival's wife looking so defeated. I did not waste time with pleasantries. I sat down and slid a tablet across the polished table. I told him I was not there to ask for a loan or a job. I was there to offer him a surrender. I told him I would hand him the core technology of Nexus Systems, the client list, and the market share he had lost 5 years ago. In exchange, I needed the full force of his legal team, a security detail, and a blank check to destroy the people who had put me in this position. Julian laughed at first. He asked why he should trust a woman who had just been publicly fired for mental instability. I did not speak. I just opened the file on the tablet labeled Evidence. I showed him the forged signatures on the high-risk loans. I showed him the shell companies Derek and Sasha were using to launder money. I showed him the email where Derek called Julian a dinosaur who was easy to rob. The amusement vanished from Julian's face. He picked up the tablet, scrolling through the documents with the intensity of a predator smelling blood. He looked up at me, and the smile he gave me was terrifying. It was the smile of a man who just realized he had won a war without firing a shot. He agreed to the terms immediately. We drafted the plan right there on a cocktail napkin. Julian would approach Nexus as a benevolent angel investor, offering to buy out their toxic debt to save the company from bankruptcy. Derek, desperate for cash to cover his embezzlement before the auditors arrived, would sign anything. He would not realize that the terms of the investment gave Julian the right to seize all assets, including personal property, upon the discovery of any financial malfeasance. It was a trap, and Derek was going to walk right into it. By the next evening, my life had changed again. Julian moved me into a secure penthouse apartment owned by one of his subsidiaries. It was cold and modern, but it was safe. He gave me a limitless credit line to rebuild my image. I hired a stylist and cut my hair into a sharp, angular bob. I bought suits that looked like armor. I was no longer the soft, tired wife. I was a warlord preparing for battle. While the lawyers prepared the paperwork, I started the psychological warfare. I wanted them jumpy. I ordered a bouquet of white lilies, the flowers one sends to a funeral, and had them delivered to Sasha with no note. I sent Derek a bottle of the cheap cologne he used to wear when we were poor, a scent he had tried to scrub from his history. I knew they would fight about it. Sasha would think Derek was mocking her. Derek would think Sasha was playing games. To ensure they remained arrogant and careless, I planted the final piece of disinformation. I paid a private investigator to post blurry photos on social media of a woman who looked like me sleeping on a park bench in Oregon. The caption read that the former CEO of Nexus looked like she had lost her mind. I watched the metrics as the post went viral. I knew Derek and Sasha saw it. I knew they laughed. They thought I was broken and hundreds of miles away, wandering in the rain. They had no idea I was sitting in a penthouse 3 blocks away, watching their digital footprint through an encrypted server, waiting for the perfect moment to strike the match. I waited in the shadowed corner of the parking garage beneath the Meridian Tower. This was where my son lived now. Derek had bought the penthouse for Leo 2 weeks ago, a bribe wrapped in glass and steel to ensure his loyalty. When the elevator doors slid open, I almost did not recognize the boy who walked out. Leo was wearing a designer suit that likely cost $5,000, and he was twirling the keys to a bright red Ferrari. He should have been in his microeconomics lecture at the university. Instead, he had dropped out to accept the title of Vice President of Strategic Development, a hollow role Derek had invented to stroke his ego. I stepped into the light. Leo jumped back, and then his expression hardened into a sneer. I did not waste time with hugs or tears. I held out a manila envelope containing the evidence I had pulled from the server. I told him to look at the papers. I explained that his father had used Leo's social security number and signature to secure 3 high-risk loans because Derek's own credit rating was destroyed. I told him that he was not a partner in the company. He was a liability shield. If the company went under, the debt would fall on his shoulders, not Derek's. Leo did not even open the envelope. He slapped it out of my hand, sending the papers scattering across the concrete floor. He laughed in my face. He told me I was pathetic and desperate. He said that Sasha was the only one who truly understood his potential. He claimed Sasha listened to his business ideas while I only ever nagged him about grades and humility. He called me a bitter, jealous woman who could not stand seeing her family happy without her. Then he delivered the final blow. He told me to stop bothering him because he had a big weekend to prepare for. He revealed that Derek and Sasha were hosting a massive gala at the Grandview Hotel on Saturday. It was going to be a dual celebration, their engagement party and the official rebranding of Nexus Systems. He puffed out his chest and told me that during the toast, they were going to announce him as the official heir to the empire. I looked at my son, but I saw a stranger. The arrogance, the greed, the blindness. He was drunk on the illusion of power. I realized then that I could not save him with words. He was too far gone. The only way to save the man he might become was to let this boy crash and burn. He needed to hit the bottom so hard that the impact would shatter the false reality they had built for him. I took out my phone. The only asset Derek had not been able to touch was the educational trust fund I had established the day Leo was born. It held nearly $2 million, intended for his tuition and first home. As the trustee, I had sole discretion. With a few taps on the screen, I removed Leo as the beneficiary and froze the assets completely. Derek would undoubtedly try to drain that account through Leo within the week, but now he would find the well dry. I put my phone back in my pocket and looked at him. The love I felt was a dull ache, buried under the necessity of what had to be done. I did not scream. I did not beg. I simply turned my back on him. I spoke one last sentence over my shoulder, my voice echoing in the empty garage. I told him not to blame me when he woke up with nothing. Then I walked away, leaving him alone with his supercar and his false confidence. The day of the Grandview Hotel Gala arrived with a sky so blue it felt like an insult. This was not just a party, it was a coronation. Derek and Sasha had rented the entire ballroom of the 6-star resort, a venue that cost $50,000 just to unlock the doors. They had flown in orchids from Thailand and hired a Michelin-star chef to cater the dinner. They were burning through the company's remaining liquidity to buy the approval of Seattle's elite, desperate to legitimize their relationship in the new brand before the financial cracks began to show. I watched the preparations from a secure van parked 3 blocks away, monitoring the feed from the hotel's security cameras. My mother, Martha, was in her element. She was wearing a gown I had bought her for her 60th birthday, holding a glass of champagne and moving from group to group. I could hear her voice through the audio pickup. She was telling the mayor's wife that Sasha was the daughter she had always prayed for. She claimed that I had always been difficult, unstable, and that Derek was a saint for putting up with me for 20 years. She was not just rewriting history, she was erasing my existence to make room for her fantasy. Inside the van, the air was cold and smelled of ozone and coffee. Julian's team of forensic accountants and cybersecurity experts sat in a row, their fingers flying across illuminated keyboards. But the real work was being done on the inside. 3 of my original engineers, men and women who had built Nexus with me in the garage days, were working the event's audio-visual booth. Derek had tried to replace them with a cheaper agency, but they had convinced him they were the only ones who knew how to operate the legacy projection system. He believed them because he was arrogant. He did not know that they had already cut the hard lines to his presentation laptop and rerouted the entire feed to the server sitting on my lap. A red alert flashed on my screen. It was a message from my contact at the bank. Derek had just scheduled a wire transfer. He was moving the remaining $4 million of liquid cash to an offshore account in the Cayman Islands. The transfer was set to execute at midnight, exactly 1 hour after the speeches concluded. He was planning to smile for the cameras, cut the cake, and then flee the country, leaving the shell of the company to implode in my hands. The timeline had shifted. We did not have days. We had minutes. I stood up and walked to the garment bag hanging at the back of the van. Sasha would undoubtedly be wearing something loud, something covered in sequins or red silk to scream for attention. I chose the opposite. I put on a tailored white suit, the fabric crisp and sharp as a blade. It was devoid of ornamentation. It was the color of a blank page, or perhaps a funeral shroud. I pulled my hair back, revealing a face that no longer held any trace of the crying woman in the motel room. Julian Thorne stepped into the van, adjusting his cufflinks. He looked at the screens, showing the oblivious crowd. Then he looked at me. He asked me quietly if I was absolutely certain I wanted to do this. He reminded me that once I walked onto that stage, the scandal would be permanent. He said I would be destroying the reputation of the name I had carried for 2 decades. I checked my reflection in the darkened window. I saw the faces of Derek, Sasha, and my mother on the monitors, laughing and toasting to their theft. I turned to Julian and spoke with a voice that was steady and completely devoid of warmth. I told him that they were not my family. I told him they were a tumor, and the only way to survive a tumor is to cut it out. The ballroom was a sea of black ties and designer gowns, suffocating under the scent of expensive lilies and champagne. On the stage, Derek and Sasha held hands, performing their nauseating pantomime of true love for the cameras. Sasha glittered in a crimson dress that cost more than my first car, looking every inch the triumphant queen. They beamed as the applause washed over them, confident that the world had bought their lie. Then Leo took the microphone. My son looked handsome and arrogant, flushed with the attention. He raised his glass and delivered the speech that broke the last tether of my heart. He called Sasha the mother he had always wanted, the woman who brought light into a house that had been cold and empty for years. He made a joke about how refreshing it was to have a woman in the house who cared more about family than spreadsheets. The crowd chuckled politely, unaware that they were laughing at the woman who had paid for the wine in their glasses. Derek stepped forward to deliver the coup de grace. He cleared his throat and prepared to announce the renaming of Nexus Systems, the final step in erasing my legacy. But as he opened his mouth, the massive LED screen behind him flickered violently. The projected image of their new logo dissolved into static, and then the room plunged into darkness. A moment later, the screen roared back to life, blazing with the original blue and white logo of Nexus Systems I had designed in my dorm room 20 years ago. The sound system crackled, and a video began to play. It was grainy, black and white security footage from the library of my own home, dated 3 months prior. On the screen, gigantic versions of Derek and Sasha sat on the sofa, drinking my vintage wine. Their voices boomed through the ballroom speakers with crystal clarity. The crowd went deathly silent as they heard Derek laugh and say that they just needed to hold on for a few more weeks until the loans were approved. Then Sasha spoke. She asked what would happen if the company collapsed under the debt. Derek waved his hand on the screen and said it did not matter because the loans were in Leo's name. He called our son a useful idiot who would sign anything to make his daddy proud. Before the gasp of the crowd could fade, the video cut to an audio recording. It was my mother's voice, unmistakable and sharp. She was speaking to Sasha. The audio filled the stunned silence. She told Sasha to take the money because Elena was just a workhorse. She said I was built for labor, not for happiness, and that Sasha deserved to enjoy the fruits of my work. Chaos erupted. A woman in the front row dropped her glass, the shattering sound echoing like a gunshot. Derek was screaming at the technicians to cut the feed, his face purple with rage. Sasha stood frozen, her hands covering her mouth as the murmurs of the crowd turned into a roar of judgment. They tried to unplug the system, but my team had locked the controls. That was when the double doors at the back of the ballroom swung open. A single spotlight cut through the darkness and found me. I stepped into the room wearing my white suit, a stark contrast to the darkness and the lies. The crowd parted for me like the Red Sea. I did not walk fast. I walked with the rhythm of a predator who knows the prey is already trapped. I walked past my mother, who had turned pale as a sheet. I walked past Leo, who was staring at the screen with the look of a boy whose world had just ended. I climbed the stairs to the stage. Derek backed away from me as if I were holding a knife, but I was only holding a microphone. I did not scream. I did not cry. I turned to the audience and gestured to the screen behind me, where documents were now scrolling. I spoke calmly, my voice steady and cold. I listed the crimes as they appeared. I pointed out the date of the tax evasion. I highlighted the forged signatures on the loan documents. I explained the mechanics of the money laundering scheme they had run through the shell companies. I prosecuted them in real time, and the entire city of Seattle was the jury. As the echoes of my accusations faded, the side doors opened. Julian Thorne walked in, flanking a team of federal agents wearing windbreakers emblazoned with the bold yellow letters FBI and officers from the Economic Crimes Bureau. The silence in the room was absolute. They did not wait for permission. The lead agent marched up the stairs, his badge glinting under the stage lights, and read an emergency arrest warrant into the microphone I had just placed on the podium. The moment the handcuffs came out, the facade of their perfect love disintegrated instantly. Derek panicked. He pointed a trembling finger at Sasha and screamed that she had manipulated the books, claiming that he was just the face of the company and knew nothing about the finances. He tried to sell her out to save his own skin. Sasha let out a shriek that sounded more animal than human. She yelled that Derek had forced her to sign the papers, screaming that she was a victim of his coercion and threats. It was a disgusting display of cowardice, and I watched it with a cold, hard satisfaction. Then came my mother. Martha pushed through the security line, her face wet with tears that might have even been real for the first time in her life. She grabbed my arm, her grip desperate and clawing. She begged me to stop this madness. She invoked the sacred bond of mother and daughter, asking how I could do this to my own flesh and blood. I did not pull away immediately. Instead, I signaled to the technician. A new document appeared on the massive screen behind us. It was a bank statement showing monthly transfers of $5,000 from the illegal slush fund directly into Martha's personal account, labeled as consulting fees. I told her loudly enough for the front row to hear that a mother does not take a salary to betray her child. She recoiled as if I had slapped her, retreating into the shadows of the stage, her shame illuminated for all to see. I looked over at Leo. He was not looking at the police or the screaming match between his father and his stepmother. He was staring at the floor, his body shaking violently. The realization that his father, the man he idolized, had set him up to take the fall for federal tax fraud had finally penetrated his ego. He slumped against the podium, sliding down until he was sitting on the stage, looking like a lost child amidst the wreckage of his inheritance. He was completely broken. The officers moved in to finalize the arrests. As they clicked the metal cuffs around Sasha's wrists, she snapped. With a feral growl, she lunged at me, her fingernails aiming for my face, desperate to hurt me one last time. She did not make it 2 steps. Julian's private security detail intercepted her effortlessly, pinning her arms behind her back. She was dragged away, kicking and screaming curses that would make a sailor blush. Julian stepped up to the microphone, adjusting his tie. He addressed the stunned press corps with the calm demeanor of a man discussing the weather. He announced that his firm had purchased the distressed debt of Nexus Systems earlier that afternoon. He explained that due to the gross violation of the contract terms and the criminal activity exposed, he was activating the immediate asset seizure clause. The implication rippled through the room like a shockwave. It meant everything was gone. The villa, the luxury cars, the offshore accounts, And even the penthouse Leo was living in were now the property of the creditor to cover the damages. They were not just going to jail, they were going to jail destitute. The seals were being placed on their doors at this very moment. As the agents hauled Derek toward the exit, he locked eyes with me. He looked small, stripped of his arrogance and his Italian suit jacket. I stepped into his path, forcing the officers to pause for a second. I looked him dead in the eye and delivered the message I had been saving for this exact moment. I asked him if he remembered saying he wanted a wife who just stayed home and enjoyed herself. I told him that now he would have plenty of time to sit still and enjoy himself in prison. It has been 6 months since the final gavel fell, echoing through the courtroom like a promise kept. The justice system moves slowly, but when it lands, it is heavy. Derek was sentenced to 15 years in federal prison for fraud, embezzlement, and money laundering. Sasha received 8 years as an accomplice. They spent their final moments as free citizens blaming each other, their so-called true love rotting into hatred and accusations before the guards dragged them away. My mother, Martha, faced a different kind of prison. Without the illicit payments from Derek's slush fund, she could no longer afford her lifestyle. Her bridge club friends, having seen the evidence of her betrayal on the news, ostracized her completely. She is now living in a state-funded nursing facility 3 towns over. She calls my phone once a week. I see her name on the screen, and I simply press the silence button. I do not hate her anymore, but I do not need her toxicity in my life. As for Nexus Systems, it was acquired by Julian's conglomerate, but I did not walk away. I stayed on as the senior creative director. I hold a significant stake in the parent company, but I no longer have to deal with the headaches of administration. I get to do what I love, which is build and create. While Julian's team handles the heavy lifting, the hardest part was Leo. My son lost everything, including the penthouse and the flashy car. He had to drop out of his fake executive life and face the harsh reality of the world. He found a job waiting tables at a diner downtown. Last week, he came to see me. He did not ask for money. He stood in my doorway, looking tired and humbled, and he apologized. He told me he was sorry for believing the lies and for hurting me. I hugged him, but I stayed firm. When he left, I did not hand him a check. Instead, I gave him a stack of books on business ethics and coding. I told him that when he saved enough tips to pay for his first semester of college tuition on his own, I would pay for the second semester. He nodded, and for the first time in years, I saw respect in his eyes. Now, I am sitting in the living room of my new home. It is a modern glass structure perched on a cliff overlooking the Pacific Ocean. It is quiet here. There are no arguments, no secrets, and no tension. My phone buzzed on the coffee table. It was a message from Julian. He was not asking about the quarterly reports. He was asking if I wanted to join him for dinner at that Italian place I like, strictly off the clock. I felt a flutter in my chest that had nothing to do with anxiety. It was the possibility of something real, something built on respect rather than utility. I stood up and walked to the fireplace, where a single photograph was resting on the mantel. It was a picture of the old family, featuring me, Derek, and a young Leo, with my mother standing behind us. It looked perfect, but it was a lie. I tossed it into the flames. I watched the paper curl and blacken, the faces of the people who tried to destroy me turning to ash and floating up the chimney. I picked up my glass of vintage red wine and walked out onto the balcony. The ocean breeze was cool against my skin. I took a sip, tasting the dark fruit and the oak, and smiled. I had walked through the fire and come out the other side, not just alive, but free. Thank you so much for listening to my story. I would love to know where you are tuning in from, so please leave a comment below sharing your location and your thoughts on how I handled my revenge. If you enjoyed this journey, please subscribe to the channel Lily Revenge Stories, like this video, and hit that hype button to help this story reach even more people.